were just wonderful, wonderful additions to the island. Oh, Phyllis, I think I need that. Of course, all these other kinds of, when you know of Monhegan Island, you always think of art, of course. Probably in the summer there were as many as 200 to 300 artists who are out there in different kinds of times. Remember, 75 people to 750 people, but I'd say at least 300 people are artists. And the history of American art is often out there. This is Rockwell Kent, who comes there in 1905, and he's part of the Ashcan School of Art with Robert Henry Ives, and many of Robert Henry Ives' kind of disciples come out there. But when Rockwell Kent is there, that's the house he builds out there. Now you might know that as Jamie Wyatt's house. Well, Jamie Wyatt buys Rockwell Kent's house that he built in 1910 at that point. So that's down by Lobster Cove there, but that's his house. And then all the, of course, great artists from George Bellows to Edward Hopper to many of the different kinds of artists. But the island is also a place of great tragedy. There have been many people, I would say probably every 3 years, there's a death on the island, either fishermen or different tourists who come on, and this is called the Edward and Jackie Memorial Library. Who were they? 2 school children who were having a birthday party down in Squeaker Cove. A wave came in and washed them away, never to be seen again. And that's what's it. But also, it's a great place of remarkable heroism as well. On December 27th, the wind, this is January 24th, 1986. It was blowing about 30 to 40 knots. The wind was, the weather was about 10 degrees, and the Monhegan Island light went off. A call went out from the mainland to the Coast Guard station here on Manana saying, get the light on immediately. So these 2 Coast Guard men had to leave with it 10 degrees, 30 to 40 knots, and take that little peapod right there to get across the island to get the light on. And they did. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. They took that peapod right there, they got in, and they slid it right down into the ocean. The only problem was the bow line snagged around one of the stanchions, and as it did, it flipped them right into the ocean. The boat turned right over, and they were in the ocean. Remember, 15 minutes to live. They didn't even know it hit them. But fortunately, it was a north wind and blew them right over to Smutty Nose Island. But they were in the water for 10 minutes. They come up on Smutty Nose Island, and they're literally freezing to death. They are dying right there because of the exposure. Fortunately, one of them had a VHF radio. He calls Boothbay Harbor Coast Guard Station, shouts, we're dying, we have to have help immediately. The man is just destitute. He knows he can't get anything out there. You can't launch a helicopter in that wind, you can't get a boat out there. So he quickly calls Sherm Stanley, one of the fishermen on the island. Sherm calls Steve Rollins, says we've got to go down, we've got to get out to Smutty Nose Island. They try to get some of the skiffs off the island, but the waves are too high. They can't get any skiffs. But they remember there's a dory, a 20-foot Grand Banks dory behind one of the fishermen's houses. They grab it, drag it down, they row for 25 minutes straight, right into the north wind. They get to those 2 men who were next to death, get them in the dory, get them back to the island, and save their lives. The Coast Guard hands out the highest award they give is the Silver Star Award for heroism and for personally saving a person's life. Both Steve and Sherm received the Silver Star Award. Now where does it come home to us? That dory that they were able to row out there was built by the Carpenter's Boatshop. To all of my apprentices, when you build, whatever you build, be sure to build well, build carefully, and build with great diligence. Because what you build might eventually have to save a person. We will go on. I'm sorry, this is crazy. Yeah. Of course, Louds Island, wonderful island, about a mile off the coast, 3 miles by a half a mile, most of it a mile at one particular section. Just a beautiful, how many have been on Louds Island, Muscongas Island? Bless your hearts. Okay. There's the north end right there. The history, of course, of Muscongas Island, and it goes by many different names. Up until 1962, it was always known as Muscongas Island. So how did it get to be Louds Island? Because a man named Edward Loud Holden, who was a direct descendant of Will Loud back in 1752, a direct descendant, worked in the cartography office in Washington. And Edward Loud Holden liked the name Louds Island, not Muscongas Island. So he personally changed the charts in 1962 to read Louds Island, not Muscongas Island. So if you get an old chart, you'll see that they're all Muscongas Island. But if, therefore, you're an old-timer, you still call it Muscongas Island. If you're kind of new around, you call it Louds Island. But the people of Muscongas Island just voted to really call it Muscongas Island from now on. So, to honor them, we'll call it Muscongas. But the history of that island, the history of that island is really the history of, I would say, 150 to 200 islands off the coast of Maine who had winter populations. There were as many as 300 islands that had year-round populations. But the history of this is the history of many of them. And that is that around 1900, there were about 200 to 250 people on Muscongas Island. It was a thriving fishing and farming island. It had 2 stores, it had a church, had a barber shop, a dance hall, and a 1-room schoolhouse for all the different people that way. In fact, the people from Round Pond bought all their supplies on Muscongas Island rather than Damariscotta. It was much easier to go by boat, of course, to Muscongas Island rather than horse and wagon all the way up to Damariscotta. So they would go there for their shopping. But then World War I came. Many of the young men went off the island, fought in the war, didn't come back because they were killed, or they liked the amenities on the mainland, automobiles, electricity, and they didn't return. World War II did the same thing, even much deeper into the population. Many went off, fought, and didn't come back. And in 1962, the death knell really occurred to the island when the state stepped in, closed a 1-room schoolhouse with 5 children in that school, and forced the younger families, of which there were 3, to go into New Harbor or Round Pond, leaving the older people to themselves on the island. And between 1962 and 64, 11 different farms sold on that island to summer people. And it was a summer island from that point on. There were some of the original people who would go back there in the summertime, but it was never lived on year-round from that point on. Except by 2 people who did move there. Yes?
I had heard a story about rebellion.
That's another lovely story, yeah. And may have actually some history behind it. What we're referring to, the story is a quick one. 1960, we have an election in this country, okay? It's with Abraham Lincoln running, and who was Abraham Lincoln's running mate? Hannibal Hamlin, thank you very much, okay? Hannibal Hamlin from Bangor, Maine, okay? And indeed, on the Republican Party, and about 1958, before the election, 18. I'm sorry, 18. Thank you, Arthur. This is a community effort. In 1858, the town of Bristol decided that their ranks were diminished. There were a lot of people over on Muscongas Island, and that they could increase their revenues by having them as part of their town. And they invited them to become a part of the town of Bristol. They accepted that. So that in the election of 1860, when pretty much all of Maine went for Abraham Lincoln, and really Hannibal Hamlin because he was from Maine, and pretty much all of Maine voted Republican, for some reason, all the people on Muscongas Island voted straight Democrat. So when that happened, the people of Bristol said, you know, we're not sure we really like to have And so they kind of nulled their actual part of the town of Bristol. But then a war developed called the Civil War. And there was a draft call coming out. And indeed, in the very first year of the draft call, in which Bristol had to put up so many different men, apparently about 16 of them were from Muscongas Island. But they said, no way. If you didn't count our votes during that election, we're not a part of your town and we're not fighting any war whatsoever. And apparently when an individual came out to try to find these men, to get them to serve their country in this way for the Union forces, he was only met by many of the women on the island who threw boiled potatoes at him as he arrived. Anyway, let's move on. How do we get on the island? We got on the island because of this church right there, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary this coming June. Or actually, I guess it's in August, then, isn't it?
August.
Anyway, it was built that way. But Ruth and I were invited by Stan Haskell, the secret, to come over in summertime to serve the Louds Island Church in that way. And we got over there, and we just loved it on Louds Island. We love Monhegan Island, but it's strictly a fishing island. But Louds Island was a fishing and farming island, just such a pastoral, tranquil kind of place. So we loved it so much. So we, when we were the ministers there, we decided that we would like to live over there, because this would be the perfect place, we thought, to begin the Carpenter's Boatshop. And we thought we could maybe buy some land and build something, or maybe even buy something. So we asked the people, do people ever sell any land here, or do they ever sell a house? They said, oh yeah, you could probably buy most anything here. They said, well, who would sell that kind of thing? They said, talk to Eddie Poland. Remember Edward Loud Poland? Okay. So they said, talk to Eddie Poland. He has over 100 acres of land. He's got a house there on the kind of the southwest side of the island. So I did. I wrote to Eddie Poland, and I wrote to another lady named Hilda Libby from New Harbor, because they both said that they might sell something to us. So Eddie, when I wrote to him and asked if he would sell me some land, he wrote right back, 1 week later, said, sure, I'll be glad to sell you whatever you want. So I wrote back and said, well, we're thinking maybe 5 or 10 acres. Writes right back, sure, I'll sell you 5 or 10 acres. I write back to him and said, well, how much would you want for that? He writes right back, whatever you can afford. I said, that's my kind of man. So anyway, we thought we would buy land from Eddie. But then 2 weeks later, I got another letter from him and said, I think I'm going to cancel out. I'm not going to do that. You see, I think it would be better for you to live in my house. You take my house for a whole year, and it's all yours for free. And at the end of the year, if you still want land, then you can buy it. We thought, wow, that's amazing. But indeed, in the spring of the year, Hilda Libby, who was the other person we wrote to us and said to us, you know, I'm very sorry. I never got back to you when you wrote to me in the fall. And the reason I didn't get back was because I was going through a very sad divorce. And I've decided that I'm going to return to my country of origin, Scotland. And I'm going to sell my place. And I'd like to sell it to you and Ruth. And I'll sell it to you for what I paid for it 5 years ago. And indeed, that is the house we actually ended up buying. And therefore, living on Muscongas Island. That was our little barn. Not a very good picture because, again, that was a brownie picture.
The house had any insulation?
No insulation. Same thing. No water, no electricity.
Not too smart.
Again, no insulation. So we were chilly, but we had lots of wood from this island. So that was really
What year are we talking about?
This is 1975. We lived on the island from 1975 to 1977. And indeed, we did all kinds of things there. We lobster fished, we clammed, we repaired houses, we rebuilt chimneys, we did some gardening. I built some boats in this little shed. That was one of the boats I built out there. And the reason I built that boat is because we used to go back. We used to serve the little church in Sheepscot, and we had a dory with a 10-horsepower Evinrude in the back. Well, I don't know if you tried to start a 10-horsepower Evinrude in February, but they just don't go in February. And I kept on saying to Ruth, you know, if we only had a good rowboat, we'd be there by now. And that was the origin for really my boat building. I decided to build a good rowboat, and that was the boat we built. So we built a couple of peapods over there, a couple of skiffs and everything, and we did sell some, but we'd always row across the island. We'd come into Round Pond there, right up into this little cove right there, and indeed, Round Pond, of course, freezes in, so Ruth would have to sit on the bow of the boat, I would row, she'd break the ice all the way from here, right up into there, to get into the harbor, and then we'd walk around and get our car, and then serve the church in Sheepscot, and then on Sunday evenings we'd row back out to the island. Yes?
How many acres was the Levy land?
It had 4+ acres. 4+ acres. So that was our kind of experience out there, and we were there for 2 full years. Then my mother-in-law was very grateful when the church in New Harbor and Round Pond, the minister died, and the bishop asked if I would serve those churches in New Harbor and Round Pond. And Ruth's mother was very grateful because Ruth was 6 months pregnant at that point, and she really didn't want her first grandchild to be born out on Loud's Island. But anyway, we did move into New Harbor, and that's how we got into New Harbor at that point. Moving along, other islands along, of course, this is a famous one, Franklin Island Light. The lighthouse was built in 1808. And the reason it's so important in the history of this area is because of a lighthouse keeper, Captain Thomas Hanna, who served from about 1830 to about 1852. Okay, Captain Thomas Hanna. He had 11 children, okay? And when the last one was born, so tradition says that Captain Hanna was in the house. The house is right here. There's still a lot of bricks that are all there because they tore the original lighthouse down. But anyway, apparently he was in the house. His wife had gone ashore to New Harbor. Word came back that he had another son, okay, the 11th child. And he said, oh my gosh, what do we call this kid? And he spun a globe, stopped the globe with his finger, and it came up on San Juan, Puerto Rico. So he said, well, I guess we'll call the kid Joanne. And that was the 11th child of Thomas and Elizabeth Hanna, Joanne Hanna. And there are still 6 generations since that still living in New Harbor. Hanna's Garage. But that's why, because they moved off of the island into New Harbor, that's why there are so many Hannas all through this area. In fact, when our daughter Hannah was born, we were reluctant to actually call her Hannah for fear that she might become a Hanna. I love the Hannas, they're great. I really should turn the floor over to Sandy at this particular point, but of course this is Harbor Island, one of the beautiful islands right in the middle of Muscongas Bay, and just a great spot there. How old is the house, Sandy?
1850.
1850s, okay. And it has just a remarkable history, and it's been in the Davis family since the 50s, isn't it?
Yes.
The story that your father told me, whether it's true or not, a lot of these things are apocryphal, but the story he related to me because Lev Davis, Sandy's father, was also my father's roommate at Williams College. Okay. So in any event, Lev always told me that the way they got the island is he loved that house. He loved it. And every summer, as he would sail by, he'd say, oh, if I could ever get that island. So he looked up on the tax maps for the name of the individual, found the name of the individual, and wrote to this lovely lady in Manhattan and asked if he could ever buy the island. If If she was ever interested in selling, he'd be interested in buying. No response. Second summer, no response. 11 summers later, he writes in the 11th time and says, I noticed that here on the northeast side there's a huge hole in the roof. The house is going to be ruined. This is the last letter I'm writing, but I'm still making my offer. I'm still wanting the house, but this will be the last letter you ever receive from me. And apparently a few weeks later, the letter came back and said, Mr. Davis, I'll be glad to sell. Persistence is very, very good. Now that may be very wrong, Sandy, but it does play a very important part of this library because Harbor Island, of course, is where Barbara Cooney used that island as the text for Harbor Island Boy. That's where it comes from. Anyway, moving along. Oh my gosh. Okay, sorry. I'll just simply say this is Bar Island, and in December 27th, again about 12 degrees, 30 knot winds, I sank right over here in a lobster boat. That's Bar Island, that's Louds Island, Muscongas Island. The boat sank right about here. It was going to flip over, so we went into the water. And as we went into the water, it's a little difficult to hit the water at that point, but I remember saying to myself the words of a wonderful old gospel song. And the words go, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Well, I'm grateful that we ended up on higher ground over here. Yes?
Bar is south of Louds?
Bar is south of Louds. It's connected by a causeway here at low tide, but again, we sank here, having hit on the south ledges of Bar Island. But we both ended up there, bruised, bleeding, and a few other things, but nevertheless, we were on higher ground. So I've loved the islands, I've sailed them and been on them, and I would only conclude by simply saying that, again, Rachel Field has a lovely little story about when she was a child. And she writes that when she was a child, there on Sutton's Island off Mount Desert, she was walking along as a 6-year-old child, and she was looking at shells in the seashore and everything. And then suddenly, as she was walking on the shore, she looked up, and there in the cleft of a rock, right near her, was this huge man with a huge beard. And she saw him and was very frightened of the man, of course, with this huge beard. And she began to turn around and walk away. And he simply said to her, "Oh, please, little girl, don't be afraid of me. You see, with me, you'd be as safe as if you were in God's pocket." That began a friendship that remained for the rest of his life. He was an old sea captain, and they became very, very close friends. So that when Rachel Field published her first book of poetry, she called the book In God's Pocket. Well, for me, being on the islands of Muscongas Bay has always been like being in God's pocket. Thank you very much.